Mark Hallyday, thanks for welcoming us in your studio for Audio and Radio YouTube channel. Could you briefly describe your activity and background? You are a Franco-American sound engineer.
Well, I'm a traditional trained engineer. I've went through the 1980s in a studio that did a lot of different types of work, pop music, rock and roll, classical music as well. From there, I started going into music producing and in parallel writing for a magazine. So I sort of deflected from my main course of work and came back to this when I founded this studio, which was in the year 2000, more or less. I went from the start in 100% in the box studio, that is 100% Pro Tools. In the year 2000, it was a little experimental because some people had used Pro Tools a lot, but not as the main axis of the studio. I went 100% in this direction, but I still use some hardware, and I've been writing also for magazines, and I've been very much involved in discussing this problem of why do we use hardware, software, and how all this art is tied together. And I'm still very interested in this. I've been doing some training also as a professional, as a teaching, I would say.
Today, music is either digital or dematerialized. What consequence this evolution implies to your work in terms of sound recording?
Well, quite a lot actually, because we've been living several revolutions since I've known this. I've been in this trade since 1980, more or less. And when I started, tubes were remembrance from the past. Apart from the few studios who had old school engineers who liked these technologies and kept them alive in a way, most studios had considered tubes were just something from the past. The main revolution being the transition from analog to digital. But what's interesting is this has been a lengthy process, and some people are still working in analog because they have issues with audio recording in digital. And strangely, tubes, which were largely discarded when I started this business. So my first studio experiences, there were no tube equipment at all in studios, apart from guitar amps. But that was more a guitarist issue. It was a musician's issue. It wasn't a sound engineer. We sound engineers had mostly, completely, not even, we had completely forgotten tube equipment. But strangely, in the late 80s and early 90s, tube equipment came back into favor because there was this idea that tube equipment sounded warmer. You know, it's sort of physical thing. The thing heats up and you think it sounds warm as well, which actually is true for certain things, but it is actually absurd in professional audio, as professional audio tube equipment used to be very clean. Strangely, we tried to apply the logic of a tube guitar amplifier to studio equipment. And what's happened since then is now people know better, and we use now combinations of old tube equipment and sometimes old vintage solid state equipment.
Such this equipment, for example.
For example, this here, this is an Avalon, the Avalon tube preamp is a product which has been 30 years, almost 30 years into production, and it still sells because it's very good, and I feel quite transparent actually. And the 1176, which is the most acclaimed compressor used for compressing vocals and solo instruments. This was started in the 70s using field effect transistors, and because at the time, Bill Putnam, who's the inventor of this thing, like all the electronics, the people who produced electronics for audio recording, they had one obsession: is getting rid of tube equipment, getting rid of valves and all the business with transformers and tubes and so on. And what's strange is now tube equipment has come back as a staple user thing, but I would say now we know how to use it. I would say that in the 90s, people wanted to use overdriven preamps, which was really, they weren't made for that. They were. Now what we have is we have companies like Thermionics in the UK, who produces valve equipment for today's tube, for the Americans, tube equipment for today's users. That is, tube equipment that can either sound very clean or, for certain things, be quite a lot of distortion, which is wanted distortion. It's not.
Yeah, you're right, because there is a big difference between, for example, if you design a guitar amp, or if you design a high-end amplifier, it's almost the same schematic, like let's say, but there is some difference in the way you design that. And when you design, let's say, a guitar amp, you are searching for distortion, and most of the time third-order distortion. And you're right, you can obtain a very clean, let's say, preamp using valve or tube, depends.
Mm-hmm.
The main difficulty is when you design an amp, and no matter if this amp is done with solid state technology or valve amplifier or whatever, or valve, the main problem is when you want to deliver power. And it's true for audio signal, it's true for radio frequency signal as well. It's very difficult to design a high power amplifier. So this property was used for the guitar amp at the very beginning, let's say during the heydays of the valve technologies. And you're right, you can obtain different sound with the valve because it was the only technology available at this time, in fact. That's the reason for
Yes.
that. So it's probably very difficult, and it is very difficult even with digital technology to try to simulate what you obtain with valve, transformer, and very classical design.
There is one particular thing in speaking 2 minutes about guitar amps. Guitar amps, there was never, I remember the late 70s, many manufacturers started making solid state amps, but they never stopped making tube amps, never. And actually what's very interesting, there are certain styles of rock guitar, like a metal, or they use very sophisticated designs because they are looking for something very particular, which is a sort of, for example, they design the very special power supply designs, because the power supply design in power guitar amps has an impact on the compression style. When you actually pluck the strings, you feel it, you feel it. This is something which is, recording technology is altogether another business, because we don't use power. We don't, all this power, this is a preamp which inputs mic level and outputs line level, which is
right.
+4 dBu. So we are not into the business of producing power. And this is why, funnily enough, some of the old tube equipment, for example, there's a very very well known in the in the studio business is something called Pultec, Pultec. Pultec equalizers were very, very popular in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. And these machines were absolutely fantastically well built. They were very rugged, and they would drive something which doesn't exist almost now. Most studios had very long cabling because some studios were made for recording full orchestras. Sometimes you had 100 meters cable at the back of equipment. So everything was built within incredible specifications. These machines were actually fantastically built. And funnily enough, afterwards, in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of junk, solid state junk has been produced. I mean, stuff which was...
Especially during the 70s.
Yes, the beginning of ICs and so on.
Yeah. During the beginning of the 70s, there was a lot of junk, let's say.
But now
which is not true now, I think. Yes.
No. What I find very exciting now is these companies. Some of them are English, some of them are Danish. Like, for example, the very interesting company called TubeTech. The Danish, when they started making these Pultec designs, have been copied millions of times, but the TubeTech copies are just fantastic, very well made, Danish type of well made. You know, it's these guys know how to produce quality stuff. So I would say that now tube equipment comes with a sort of a quality tag. But there are companies now making there is a ongoing debate about some companies who are producing, I would say, lower grade tube equipment, because you can buy cheap tubes really now from all over the world. It used to be the ex-Soviets who used to make all these tubes, and but now you have some companies who are really going into designing cheap, but not such badly done tube equipment. So tube equipment definitely is not dead.
Which is amazing considering this technology.
Totally amazing.
Totally amazing. Tube amplifier is supposed to have a specific distortion. As a result, we can say that a valve amplifier is an effect amplifier, let's say, because it's due to the technology. Is this property used in the recording, or is it simulated, or now, or do you use a digital equipment instead of an analog system?
Well, I can essentially speak for myself, since I use mainly virtual technology. That is, I work in the box, as we say. But something interesting has been happening for the last 10 years, and it's accelerating today. We use valve processors. Some companies actually make, like Thermionics in UK, they make valve equipment, or tube equipment if you want, which is specifically made for audio professionals, but essentially to bring distortion or effects, really. And or, for example, compression. We use a lot of compression in the audio world, and there's a lot of debate about bus compressors, etc. And valve compressors are very sought after for the some people call it glue, because it makes your music more compact in a way. But what is happening is there are an increased amount of people who are making tube equipment, who are selling it, but they issue a virtual version of the same machine. They actually sell the copy, the digital copy of the machine. It's interesting because many people like me work like this. For example, I have bought a machine which is a plugin. We call them plugins because they actually plug into our main software. And for example, there's a particular type of distortion box, let's call it like this, called the black box. Now the black box is actually a very expensive tube unit which is sold by the company who makes that. But they licensed another company to actually make an imitation. So they get money from that, so they benefit from that as well. Because I am not going to buy a $3,000 machine like
only
this.
But
only for this effect, because originally it was made for mastering studios. I use it mainly on maybe some from time to time in mastering, but mainly for a few instruments or a vocal or something. And it's become a tool in my toolbox. And it actually, what's interesting is this is a creation. It's been created a few years back, but it's not a vintage equipment because it's made to actually simulate overdriven pentode and triode valves.
Yeah, I understand.
We can fill with these. And so that is the main thing which is happening now is we are using increasingly imitation of valve equipment. Is that a digital simulation of valve equipment? And they're getting better and better. The early ones weren't very good, but we are, funnily enough, simulating distortion is actually easier in digital sometimes than some other other type of works. For example, emulating a digital filter, emulating a tube filter with a digital equipment is complicated because filters have very intricate responses, whilst simple distortion, actually, we are discovering that it's less complicated to do. So there are many of them I used, and they come in different flavors. You have some are more into soft clipping and I would say trimming edges, trimming peaks, unwanted peaks. But some others are better, don't do that, and are better at coloring the sound. That is actually adding distortion, whatever the level. It's just like a transfer function which adds distortion to everything.
Yeah.
And these machines are getting more and more sophisticated. You can actually decide if you want more distortions in the mids or in the lows and the highs. This is getting a real, I would say, digital technology has enabled to we started imitating valve technology, but we've gone now much further. We are actually making machines which are digital equivalents, but which can push the thing much further.
One more question before looking at this plugin on the software or on the laptop here. One more question is concerning the tone controls you have on the amplifier. As you know now, the new, let's say, amplifier you can find on the market do not have any tone controls anymore. One of the reasons is we have to respect the work or job done by the sound engineer. And what is your opinion about this disappearance concerning the tone controls?
My first reaction would be to say it's damn stupid, but I have to explain why. There are a few people who have the budgets to actually build themselves a sort of auditorium in their cellar or whatever, and spend a lot of money, acousticians, to get the acoustics quite right for the drivers they use, for the speakers they use, because each speaker will react slightly differently. And I can understand that in that kind of context, you may want to use that. If you believe the record you're listening to is perfect, which, I mean, sometimes they are not. But the problem, actually, we are in the middle of a new revolution. The revolution is now there are many systems which come with system software, which actually is going to analyze the room and try to compensate. Now, obviously, in this kind of context, this low-high tone control is like...
yes, but you are talking about €1,000 or $1,000
yes.
equipment. Honestly, for me, I mean, technically speaking, the disappearance of this tone control is a nonsense.
It is. I feel it's
a nonsense, because you may decide to add some bass or treble or whatever you want to depend, and after that it's a question of taste, you know, and you have probably to correct that, and also our ability to hear due to the age as well, our ear aging.
The aging of the ear, yes, but there's also, it all boils down to user experience. It's the user experience which is important. That is, you have to respect the user. I am really disgusted by certain multimedia systems which have grossly badly balanced systems which have 10 times too much bass. I have to buy a couple of times a little multimedia system. Obviously, there are some with a tone control, with at least a bass control.
And you may have that for example, if you buy a headphone now, especially for the headphones.
That's another issue.
It's another issue, you know. And for sure, the bass or the low frequency are very, very preeminent. Let's say in this sort of headphone, and most of the time you have to reduce the bass, but it's not due to the recording or to the amplifier or whatever. It's very purely due to the headphone itself.
No, but
you have to pay a lot of money, you know, to have.
No, but there's a very interesting issue here, because for the last 20 years, users and producers of music have been chasing each other around the block. That is, the producers want people to experience that their record is louder than the others.
Yeah.
And the user keeps taking the volume slightly down. You see, we're chasing this. And lately, since the people are listening to music now on speakers at relatively low volume, it's I mean, most people don't listen to music on big systems. If you see, and what is happening is producers are actually extending the low frequency response of the music to try to cheat their way into giving a sort of higher volume sensation. So I'm in the middle of this, because I do mastering, and this is a fight, actually. We are fighting for this. And the fight is over now on streaming services, since streaming services have a level normalizing system.
Yeah.
But this doesn't exist still on hi-fi and so on. So this is a real problem. I believe you cannot get rid of tone controls like this, because if you take a speaker and you put it on the shelf, you put it on the floor, you put it next to a wall or in a corner, and in all these cases you will have a different bass response.
That's right.
So what's the point of saying I mean, what's the natural sound? You know, on the shelf or on the... So, I mean, people should be able to actually choose how they put their speakers at home. But I can understand the idea. But obviously this idea is okay if you have a very high-level software system that actually compensates on this is crazy, you know.
Yeah, there is also user experience as well. We can talk about
User experience. I am my job. I feel my job is giving a good user experience and trying when I do mastering, because I do recording, mixing, and I also do mastering. Mastering is something different because somebody will bring something which I haven't mixed at all. It's something which is new to me. And the idea is to make it somehow standardized, make it such that people will say, oh, won't say it lacks bass or too much treble and so on. Obviously, I do it with my taste, but obviously my main focus is user experience. What is the comfort of listening to? What's the point of making music with 10 times too much bass? You have the right to do it, but most users will just, you know, say next. These are 3 typical plugins that we use, which are tube emulations. And to show how wide the use can be, the first one, which is labeled Puig Tech, is in fact emulation of a famous producer called Puig that possesses one of these Pultec equalizers. Pultec equalizer being a very, very well-known tube design that lasted for a very long time, since the late 50s or at least maybe the 60s really, and part of the 70s, and now are back into fashion. But this is the plugin, but it essentially used as an equalizer. The black box is something else altogether, because it is really a distortion box that is with a pentode and a triode emulation, and depending on the program material you are treating, you may want a lot of distortion, or use as the hardware unit was meant to be used, which is a mastering unit, and you can do very, very subtle distortion. And the whole problem of setting very subtle distortion is actually when you start hearing it, usually you have too much of it. So it's a complicated machine. This is really a sound engineer tool. And a complicated machine, but more easy to use, is this incredible imitation of a tape recorder. These J37s were 3 or 4 track recorders made by a Swiss company called Studer, which also made Revox. And Studer had a sort of semi-monopoly in Europe on tape recorders. And this, Abbey Road had many of them with the Beatles and all that. And this is typically emulated on one of those machines. So you can actually change tape formulation, speed, even do a bit of delay.
It's amazing to see the quality of the emulation.
Luckily, the audio quality is quite good as well, because it's not always the case. I mean, sometimes some plugins are
very nice, but
nice looking, but I would say that's about it.
Yes, really. It's always the same picture in audio, let's say, product or production. Most of the time, you have a very good cosmetic aspect. Let's say, it doesn't mean that the system correctly works or not, or the performance are very good, but it's audio.
For the moment, the fashion goes for this, but there are companies like DMG Audio, which is a UK-based developer, who uses very modern and very slim user interfaces. He works with a Polish designer, graphic designer, and they actually advertise the fact that they don't want any of this, and they are strictly business and very lean and efficient user interface. I quite like this because all this looks very nice, but sometimes it's kind of distracting.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Michaelides, thanks very much for this quick talk, let's say, about distortion. I'm sure it will be for interest our subscriber.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. It's an interesting subject.
It's an interesting, yeah, because it's absolutely, let's say,
we could speak for ages.
For ages, yes, and it's absolutely counterintuitive to do that.
Yes, it is.
But when you design an amp, the idea is to reduce as much as possible the distortion process, and we have spent half an hour, I don't know, right
we're
now.
The saboteurs.
Yeah, about the way to adding distortion for recording. So thanks very much.